Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today, I am joined by the infamous, or famous, if you will, Hugo Mendez. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing all right, Derek. How are you?
I'm doing good. Of course, I'm just being funny here. Please take no offense. You were on our show before. One time we had you on, we were talking about John. We might get into John a little bit today, but for those who don't know, can you give us a little bit of your background, what your expertise is? And you have a 27 lecture series that's you're teaching. You're going to break down the whole New Testament. What are you doing in this lecture series?
Yeah. So, I'm an associate professor in New Testament and early Christianity at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This is my ninth year at UNC. And yeah, the kind of big things that I've been working on for the last several years have been the origins of the Gospel of John and of the epistles of First, Second, and Third John. I've been arguing specifically that these texts are pseudepigraphical. They are, if you will, ancient forgery and a chain of ancient forgeries. But right, the next thing that I'm working on this spring is I'm teaching a 27 lecture course through the Bart Ehrman Biblical Studies Academy, specifically on the New Testament. We call it Exploring the Christian Bible, in which in 27 lessons, we'll be going through the entire New Testament canon, and you'll be getting in that particular format the same class that I give to my undergraduates at UNC, that I train my graduate students on at UNC. It's your chance to step into my classroom and get to see how it's done at this sort of a
Oh.
level.
Wow, wow, wow. So I ask everyone who's interested, the link is in the description. You can go there and sign up today. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about the New Testament briefly. You just mentioned a chain of pseudepigraphy or forgeries. That what does that even mean? And would that be a problem for someone who wants to approach this text saying this guy wrote this and this is historical and everything that it says is what happened?
Yeah. So most texts in the New Testament claim to have somebody writing them, right? They might start off as a letter that actually says Paul as the very first word. They want you to think it's written by Paul. One of the things that we've understood as scholars now for over a century is that this actually doesn't bear a lot of critical scrutiny. That if you go through the 13 letters of Paul and maybe add Hebrews to that, right? Six of them are might have Paul at the beginning, but they were not actually written by Paul. Hebrews itself doesn't claim necessarily to be written by Paul, but it looks a lot like somebody who's trying to get you to think that they're Paul who isn't. So one of the challenges we have when we study the New Testament is we have to sift through, what do these texts present themselves as? Who do they claim as their authors? And what do we really know about what these texts are, where they came from, who might have written them? And in a class like, an introductory course on New Testament, one of the most difficult challenges is walking my students through, actually, you can quickly do the math. Half of this literature, most of this literature is actually falsely authored literature.
Hmm. So wouldn't that open a can of worms on almost this is coming from an angle you're probably not used to because academics such as yourself and most of them, when I bring in the everyday world kind of on the ground religious activity and apologetics people have into this, wouldn't that create a problem for someone who wants to argue like kind of a fundamentalist inerrant approach, or even not just that, of course that's apparent, but like when we read this literature, we can trust and know that it is saying facts on the ground about what actually happened, or this person really said these things. Like, wouldn't that raise extreme doubts on how we should trust what this material is saying?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. If your entire framework for approaching these texts is the idea that they are presenting to you literally, straightforwardly, the historical fact and truth, then you're going to run up against a problem in the very first word of a lot of these documents. If Paul is not really Paul, then all of your assumptions have to change about this, which is why I think this topic, yeah, as you're kind of noting, is one that tends to be really uncomfortable for a lot of different Christian communities. One of the reasons why a lot of people exercise a lot more energy into trying to dispel, so to speak, the questions and doubts around this literature than they do just honestly confronting, grappling with, all right, this is our starting point. What does that mean for every subsequent thing? Dogma, in a lot of cases, tends to overrule just good scholarship.
I know I've read Bart's counter forgery, and gone through that. But like, I guess immediately in my mind, when you say, for example, your focus being first, second, third John, and then the Gospel of John's origins, and these maybe forged is like a link or a chain of forged material. In my mind, I go, okay, hold on. I can imagine someone trying to go, okay, maybe that guy didn't write it, but it's in the school of that guy. Now, is this a softening approach of the problem, or is it in your estimation accurate to say that there's noble reasons behind forging these letters, and it's purely like an okay thumbs up thing? Or is there, I don't know if the right word is deceptive motive of like, let me trick you into thinking it's this guy. Where do you and the academics tend to land on this issue of like, you could see an apologist who might confront this evidence and go, I can't unsee this. So now I'm going to make it like, actually, this was a noble thing, and communities of Christians had no problem with saying that Paul, or they're purposely wanting you to believe that this is Peter, or this is Paul, or this is John, but it's really not the guy. And it's kind of a sleight of hand. What is your position?
Yeah. I think my position is that in a lot of cases, we're not really going to know entirely, although I think we can work from the starting point that there is something that is intrinsically deceptive about claiming that you're a different kind of author, right? Now, you can kind of work through all of the ethical ramifications of that. You can run all the flow charts you want through, you can have a lot of fun with it, but that doesn't kind of change the first brick of this, which is you are not this person, you are claiming you are this person. And, you're right that a lot of scholars try to really develop a lot of different explanations, bring in lots of different contexts that could try to soften the blow of this. There are, kind of pedagogical reasons why you do that. You might have a room full of students and you might want to have them perhaps think of every possibility before they necessarily jump to just one possibility. Some of this is that a lot of scholars are church facing. They're, ordained. They teach in religious institutions, and they're very much worried about how a word like forgery hits or deception hits. Um, Personally, as a scholar, I think that you have to accept the broad realm of possibilities as being in play. And I think that you can't at the same time rule out some really obvious possibilities like this is deception. This is strictly somebody who wants to present themselves as someone who they're not, who has no organic connection to the original author, but feels entitled in one way or another for one reason or another to write under their name. I think that scholars make a huge mistake when they bracket out some possibilities, some vocabularies like deception. I'd like to keep everything at bay because I don't think it's necessarily one or the other. I think it can be a both and.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I could do something where I'm lying, but I have a noble cause behind why I believe I'm doing this. And
Yeah.
therefore, you could say, well, it depends on what angle you're looking at it. And I immediately was thinking second century for just a second before we shift gears to something different. And that is how, when we're reading these church fathers and they talk about Valentinians claim Paul as their guy, or
Yeah.
Marcionites, they claim Paul, they have this like, they're like, I would almost want to use the word fabricating a genealogy.
Mhm.
Um, and if there is anything to it, we have no way to verify anything that they're claiming, but they're claiming a genealogy back to Peter, claiming a genealogy back to Paul. We knew the guy who knew the guy and taught by the guy. Like, this all sounds like a political myth, a political myth in the church to give one power. And a lot of this stuff seems like it's probably like you're talking about with crafting forgeries and stuff to bolster the communities that we find in the second century in a lot of cases. For example, M. David Litwood was talking about in the latest video I did on Celsus or Celsus, depending on how you want to pronounce the name, that he was seeing the Gospels as myths, or at least they have lots of myths in them. and that he thought maybe Second Peter's passage, which talk about these are not cleverly divine myths, as some would suppose, is maybe actually inserted in this forged letter, reacting to Celsus's claims about these being myths. I
Mhm.
mean, how do you know with certainty? You don't, but like he was giving arguments of Alexandria and trying to geographically locate, and maybe it was put there. All right, there was a lot there, but as far as this goes, is that am I on the right track in your mind?
If I'm understanding, yeah, I mean, we have no problem when we see other proto-Catholic communities doing the same kind of thing, right? So when we see the Valentinians, you know, claiming lineages that don't seem to quite cohere with anything that we would think of as really historical evidence, we have reasons to question that apparently. When we see some communities like Sethian Gnostics bring out forged pseudepigraphal literature all the time, we have no problem saying they're doing it potentially, in many cases, to try to get this literature more widely read. Yeah, we tend to kind of treat, I think, proto-Catholic stuff a little bit differently, because of our own kind of sometimes as scholars positionality within that tradition and all the forms it developed into, right? Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant. I think that if we look at the second century, it's clear that someone like Irenaeus is trying to position himself as a successor of the apostles, trying to link all these different Christian communities as successors of the apostles, just the way that the Valentinians are claiming the legacy of Paul and other sorts of teachers in some sort of line. And Christians are claiming scriptures that they say are written by the apostles, just the way that these other groups are also claiming scriptures that they say are written by the
Mhm.
apostles. A lot of, I think, what we have to do as scholars is to cut through all of this and try to really just get to what can we know, what can't we know about all this. And if there is this invention of apostolic lineage, succession, authority, actually authorship, where does that come from? What's it responding to? Why does it exist? We're not going to tell a complete story of ancient Christianity unless we can just kind of slice right into those core questions.
Wow. So getting your like very, very, very specialist observations pertaining to John and the letters of John, what is happening in this chain of literature here specifically? We hear the Johannine school, but can you briefly tell us what you think's happening? I don't know if you have an answer to this because lots of scholars are like that's conjecture or whatever, but why was John written in your view? And then maybe what's going on with these letters that are in the tradition of John that are trying to tie back to the Johannine gospel?
Yeah.
Or is it the gospel that's tying into I don't know.
I know, you're great, you're great. I think the majority of scholars very clearly think the gospel came first and then the letters, and I'm 100% on board with that. You can take these 4 texts, the Gospel of John, the letter of First John, the letter of Second John, the letter of Third John, you can line them all up and you can see the direct literary relationships between them. You can see direct borrowing, direct imitation, where the author of First John is very clearly copying parts of the gospel in an attempt, I think, to take over the same authorial persona. So, what I've argued is that the Gospel of John was probably written around the turn of the second century. It's a text that knew earlier Gospels. It's written in a format and a style that very much evokes Matthew, Mark, and Luke on purpose, I think. It knows those texts, it wants to compete in the same field. Its author presents his gospel as an eyewitness piece, but there's every reason for thinking this gospel is not an eyewitness piece. Specifically, above all, this gospel has a different theology than the synoptics. This gospel tells different stories of Jesus that are at the service of that theology. They look like stories that have been modified, tailored, in some cases, even outrightly invented for the purpose of supporting a theology. This gospel is introduced, it's circulating, and it seems that in probably even just a few years, someone comes along, thinks that they have another point to make. This is the author of First John, and decides, I'm going to write a successor work to this gospel. I'm going to present it as if it's by the same author. I'm going to imitate that author's style. I'm going to position myself as an eyewitness in the very first verses too, so that you know that I'm that eyewitness who wrote that gospel. And he pulls that off. he has a different purpose in mind. And then later on, you have these other letters, 2nd and 3rd John, which, by the way, ancient Christians, we know for centuries questioned the authenticity of. We hear Eusebius cite Origen, saying that not all Christians think they're genuine. We have Eusebius himself saying that in the 4th century, there were lots of Christians who disputed the authenticity of 2nd and 3rd John. We know that Syriac Bibles didn't include these texts into the 6th century. So maybe Christians in antiquity didn't pick up all of the pseudepigraphy, all of the forgery in this line, but they were definitely at least seeing it in some of these later texts. And so a lot of what I'm doing as a scholar is trying to flesh out a new history of these works that actually just foregrounds, centers the very kind of questions ancient Christians were asking about some of these texts, which were, are these even authentic?
Mm. Just honing in on John, and maybe you can express the theology in the letters as well that is trying to say that they are the author that wrote that gospel. You brought up some interesting things. First of all, there's evidence that they're trying to say they're eyewitness, but there's really good reason to think they're not eyewitnesses.
Mhm.
Can you explain what leaps? I know you're writing your book. Just to tease everybody, we will be doing a thorough, I imagine, interview promoting the book when it comes out in 2025.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Should be.
So why
It's already
sh
done. It's there. It's now
yeah,
in process. Yeah.
okay. So we will I can't wait to do that with you and to hear what you bring to the table, but what evidence is there to doubt that this is actually eyewitness?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with the fact that the theology of John is so different than one would expect for a text written by an eyewitness who knows Jesus. You can read the synoptic gospels, you can put Mark, Matthew, and Luke together, and you can get some feeling for what Jesus said and taught. That's not to say that each of these, gospels necessarily don't have issues of their own. It's just, sufficient to say that there really is kind of a core, consistent set of themes that emerges from these earliest accounts of the life of Jesus. You can go even further back. You can kind of look at the letters of Paul and get some sense of what Paul's relating about who Jesus was, what he said. And you get to John, and John is a different landscape. The theology that Jesus expresses in John, ideas that, for instance, he is divine, and specifically the divine logos, the word, something that is expressly said in the first chapter, but is kind of more subtly woven throughout the entire book. It's a way of thinking about Jesus's identity that is anchored in a certain kind of engagement with Greek philosophy, with Hellenistic Jewish philosophy, that we wouldn't reconstruct for Jesus, and that certainly made no clear footprint in any of the earlier accounts of Jesus' life. You can take a look at how Jesus will then describe this notion that when he ascends into heaven, when he departs in the Gospel of John's vocabulary, that he will be in his believers spiritually, and that they will be in him spiritually in heaven, that they will have access to celestial realms in him. This kind of very complicated idea of a mutual indwelling, of a pneumatic existence and access to heaven. I mean, these are beautiful, wonderful concepts. They are not the kinds of concepts you're seeing Jesus say in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And so, one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, where is this material coming from? If this was as central to Jesus's teachings as the Gospel of John would have you believe, where Jesus touches on these points every single speech, every single chapter, then how do they not make a trace, a dent in earlier Gospels? We don't ask this question when we see, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas completely rewrite the teachings of Jesus in the 2nd century. We don't have this problem when we see the Gospel of Mary completely rewrite the teachings. Gospel of Judas, right, completely rewrite the teachings of Jesus. What I'm arguing is that the Gospel of John has to be treated the same kind of way. It is in this kind of, sort of expression, right, of Moody Smith, it's the first apocryphal gospel. It isn't. It is. It's a gospel that's doing something very much like these 2nd century texts. It has a different theology that it wants to present to you. It's going to use Jesus as the vehicle of that theology. It's going to rewrite his words. So, just as we wouldn't think too deeply about the eyewitness claims of some of those 2nd century texts, then to kind of wrap it up, I
Yeah.
also think that we need to be very measured and skeptical of the
Seems
eyewitness
like a
claims of
trope.
John.
Eyewitness seems like a trope that you
Yeah,
would use,
totally.
and Robin Faith Walsh talked about that as well, like a it's not just biblical, but, like, it seemed to be well known when you're writing a story, you do this, or when you're writing books, this gives you a sense of authority as well. Um, but to get into the theology, trying to pin the tail on the donkey of what is this theology that we find in this apocryphal John,
Mhm,
I came across Irenaeus, I believe it's Irenaeus. Nope, sorry, Clement of Alexandria was talking about the Epiphany of Christ, the baptism being celebrated on the Nones of Janus, which is January
mhm.
the 5th. And today Christians still celebrate Armenian Orthodox. There's
Or
several groups
January
that,
6th, yeah.
yeah, January 6th, the night of the 5th into the 6th. He was saying that Basilides,
Oh,
this
yeah, good.
early Gnostic teacher, and part of his corpus was supposedly this gospel. So we come to find out what Basilides believed. He was an adoptionist who thought Jesus was incarnate at baptism. He didn't have a birth narrative, it seemed. Well, I found it ironic, and I'm just doing a little deductive reasoning. Help me out wherever my mind goes here. But like, I'm reading the only other gospel before John is Mark, which gets him at the baptism. The Holy Spirit comes down. There's no Matthew and Luke birth. So I'm curious to know, is John Gnostic-y? Is John adoptionistic? Is what's the theology in your estimation, or is it a reaction to some of these things? Is this been redacted as well, so we don't know what I don't know what the answer is, but I
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, so, like, where does it fit on that scale of
Right.
the kind of incarnational theology that's gonna be very typical of the Proto-Catholic tradition? Or something like, yeah, the kind of spirit possessionist stuff, the stuff that we might coordinate with things like maybe Cerinthus, maybe Basilidians, something like that, in one form or another. Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to kind of maybe say to that question is that John clearly wasn't specific enough about whatever he said to have avoided the fate of being read and beloved by so many groups that had very different theologies of Jesus, right? So you're going to find in the late second century, sure, someone like Irenaeus reading this gospel, you're also going to see this gospel have entire commentaries written by the Valentinians. You're going to see, obviously, the Sethian Gnostics plugging into this gospel because they will literally have the Apocryphon of John be sort of the sequel of this gospel, another, forged pseudepigraphal work. So I'll kind of start with the sort of point of, unfortunately, I don't think John gave us enough to prevent everyone from loving this gospel. I think that's part of what ensured its survival. That's probably
Oh.
also what ensured its broad popularity. Um, I will say that if you read the Gospel of John closely enough, in terms of how does Jesus talk about his disciples and what will happen to them when they receive the Spirit. I'm one of many John scholars who think John has a very clear idea of deification, that when one accepts the Spirit, one accepts the indwelling presence of Jesus, that they themselves are deified. And in that case, I think it's very natural for some second century readers to read this gospel and to wonder if Jesus had undergone a similar process at his baptism. And there are at least some scholars who have made that kind of argument that John has an adoptionist streak. These are figures like, Francis Watson, I think, has made an argument like this for sure in print. Certainly, Gitte Buchansen has done something with this. Um, and it gives you kind of a different take on what John might have been doing. There are, of course, other scholars who do the exact opposite. Schnelle, who argues that no, this is very kind of typical incarnationalist, even anti-docetic are the terms he'll use. I'm so far currently enjoying flirting with all the different ideas as I try to sort of pin down this complicated book.
I love that you're open and just having fun with the text and not needing to necessarily go down a particular school of thought. Entertain it. And if it isn't so certain, we shouldn't be ourselves. And so I think this is a fun exercise mentally. Look, ladies and gentlemen, Hugo Mendez, go sign up. 27 lectures. there's so much more that I'd like to get into with John, but we're gonna have to wait for that because your book is coming out this next year. And when I say I'd like to go deep into this with you, I wanna get into this. Like, I don't wanna cover the whole book, of course, but, like, enough to get people to buy the book, right? Which helps, academics such as yourself constantly put it out there because you put a lot of time in your life into learning this and studying this material, and I like to learn about this. So, any final words from you and, about the lectures, about this conversation?
Yeah, no, I think the fun of whatever we do are all the unknowns, all the questions, all the debates, and you know, I've kind of said this in some other settings, but I went to a fundamentalist college where literally the first time I ever took New Testament was 2 semesters where I had to sit there with a teacher who knew exactly when everything was written, who wrote it, where it was written, what it said, and what it meant. And of course, it matched up precisely with his theology and the theology of the church that sponsored that college. And I remember being bored to death in that classroom. Like it's the greatest miracles that I'm a New Testament scholar today because I was taught exactly not that interesting a version of this. Let alone when you encounter the New Testament in Sunday schools, in church settings where there's such a tight clamping and control of what questions are appropriate, how should you interpret this text. One of the things that I love as a teacher is just the debate, the kind of throwdown. My colleague and I, my closest colleague in the department is Bart Ehrman at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And that's all we damn do. Every single time we have a drink or dinner, like
Art
we're just
debate?
art
No
debate. Yeah, I
way.
mean,
Are
but
you
that's it, right?
Me
And
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 him were having a wrestling match in our last conversation, but I
This is
understand.
this is him. This is what he loves doing, but this is the best part of our field, right? You get to have that. So the fun of this course that I'm gonna teach is we're gonna have live Q&A sessions. You're gonna get to bring the questions. We can wrestle with this. We can have fun, and I mean, the number one thing that I've really enjoyed as a teacher is, there are ways as a teacher sometimes you're kind of measured a little bit in what you give your responses, but yeah, you can totally actually extract the real answer from me, or at least the answer that I think. And so we'll have a lot of fun through this entire semester course, so to speak, getting to the bottom of this, digging through all these kinds of questions. I'm really looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to it. This is gonna be fantastic. I hope more people will go sign up, become a student, stay learning more and more because we want to know, we want to understand, and, as much as we can about this ancient material. I mean, people go, "Why are you so obsessed with this? You're no longer considered a quote unquote Christian." I don't know, it's only the most popular religion on planet Earth, and it's only been so influential for 2 millennia. My whole family is Christian. I was Christian.
Well, and
That
Derek, you're
might be
probably
why.
enjoying it more in this format than you ever did before.
Way, way more. I mean,
Yeah.
reading the Protestant fathers, as we'd call them in the Reformed Church, like,
Hmm.
so freaking boring. I think the only thing I really thought was really cool when I initially became a Calvinist at the time was predestination, just philosophically trying to think through about, like, God knows everything, and if he loves you and he's got your back. But then you had to wrestle with these huge pills about, like, what about the people he doesn't love? And, like, these things, and then there's so much. I got into that debate for many years, and then I'm so glad now where I'm at, I have the freedom to I feel treat not only biblical stuff, but like any and all religions with the freedom of looking at them in very much the same ways, even though there's differences. It's like, I don't know how to describe it, but the walls aren't there. That tribalistic kind of dogmatism that we bring is not there at all.
Yeah. The fun
So
starts. Yeah.
the fun starts. Links in the description. Sign up today. Thank you so much. And never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision.